The intercom had already gone silent by the time I understood what it had said. Not the words. I'd heard the words clearly enough. Stay in your classrooms. Lock doors. Do not open them for anyone until further notice. I'd heard all of that. What I hadn't understood, not right away, was that the person saying it believed every syllable. That this was not a drill, not a test of our lockdown protocols, not someone's idea of a poorly executed training exercise on a Wednesday morning in October. The voice, and I'm fairly sure it was Janet Kessler, the assistant principal, though it didn't sound quite like her, had said those things with a quality I've spent the days since trying to name. Compression, maybe. Like the voice had been folded in on itself to fit through the speaker without breaking apart. I turned the lock on the classroom door. Room 214, second floor, East Wing. American History, third period. 26 students, all juniors. I remember that number because I'd taken attendance 7 minutes before the announcement, and Cameron Weiss had been the last to arrive, sliding in with a late pass from the counselor's office, and I'd noted him as number 26 in my head the way I always do. Not because the number mattered, but because full attendance is unusual for a Wednesday, and unusual things tend to stick. I told them to stay calm. I said it the way I've said everything in classrooms for 11 years, clearly, without urgency, as if the instruction were no different from asking them to open their textbooks to Chapter 9. I said we were in a lockdown and that we should follow the procedures we'd practiced. Move away from the windows. Sit along the interior wall. Stay quiet. I didn't say anything about what the announcement had actually said, because at that point I was still sorting it, still placing the words into a framework that made sense. The framework I had was the school's emergency plan, the laminated card zip-tied to the inside of my desk drawer, and I followed it the way you follow a recipe you've made enough times that your hands know it even when your mind is elsewhere. The first few minutes were nothing. Silence, mostly. The particular silence of teenagers trying to be quiet and mostly succeeding, punctuated by the occasional whisper, a shoe squeaking on linoleum, someone's phone vibrating against the floor. I stood near the door and listened. The hallway was empty in the way hallways are during class periods. Not dead quiet, but holding only the ambient hum of the building itself, the ventilation system, the distant whir of the elevator nobody uses. Normal sounds. I told myself that. What I should explain is that the morning had already been strange before the intercom. Not dramatically strange. Not in ways that announced themselves. But I drive in on Route 11 every morning, and that morning traffic had been different. Not heavier or lighter, but patterned wrong. There were gaps where there shouldn't have been gaps, clusters where the road is usually smooth. 3 ambulances passed me heading west in the span of about 4 miles, which is more than I'd ever seen on that stretch at 7 in the morning. When I got to school, the parking lot felt thin. Not empty, but thin. Several of the spots usually taken by staff were open, including the one belonging to Dave Richter, the chemistry teacher who has parked in the same spot for 22 years and has never, in the time I've known him, missed a day. The front office, when I passed it, had a quality of controlled activity that I associated with snow days or water main breaks. People moving with purpose but not explaining why. I teach history. I notice patterns. I note when things deviate from the established sequence. That morning I noted all of these things, filed them, and proceeded to first period, because deviations don't always mean something, and because the habit of a school day is powerful. First period was normal. Second period was normal. Between second and third, I checked my phone in the faculty bathroom and saw 4 missed calls from Sarah, which was unusual. Sarah does not call during the school day unless something is wrong with Eli, and when I tried to call back, the call didn't connect. Not a busy signal, not voicemail, just silence, then nothing. I tried again, got the same result, put the phone in my pocket, and went to third period. Then the intercom. Then the lock. Then 26 students sitting against the wall in varying states of confusion, looking at me because I was the adult, because the room was mine, because in the absence of information, authority becomes a kind of gravity, and they hadn't yet learned to resist it. I want to be clear about something. I am not someone who handles crises particularly well, or particularly badly. I am organized. I prepare my lessons a week in advance. I keep a seating chart updated to the day. I return graded papers within 48 hours. These are not heroic qualities. They are the qualities of a person who manages anxiety through systems, who feels most stable when the next 3 steps are visible. What I'm saying is that the early part of that first day was not difficult for me, because the early part still had steps. Lock the door, move students, wait for instructions. The steps existed, and I followed them, and for a while that was enough. The first real crack came about 40 minutes in, when Marcus Dean raised his hand even then, and said, "Mr. Calloway, my mom works at Mercy General, and she texted me that the ER is closed. She said they locked the doors from inside." He was holding his phone, and his face had the particular expression of a 16-year-old trying to process information that doesn't fit any category he has. Not fear, not yet. Confusion at a frequency that hadn't found its pitch. I said something measured. I don't remember the exact words, but it was something about not drawing conclusions from partial information, about waiting for official guidance. The kind of thing that sounds responsible and means almost nothing. What I was actually thinking about was Sarah's calls, the ones I hadn't answered, and the fact that my phone now showed no signal at all. Not weak signal, no signal. The little bars had simply absented themselves, and the phone sat in my pocket like a stone. Other students had been looking at their phones too. Some still had signal, some didn't. The information coming in was fragmentary and contradictory, and, in the way of all information filtered through social media and text messages in a crisis, both too much and not enough. Someone had posted a video from the Walmart on Route 6 showing people running in the parking lot, but the video was shaky and short and could have been anything. Someone else had a text from a parent saying the National Guard was being called up, but the text was already an hour old and there'd been no follow-up. A girl named Priya Chandrasekaran, who was usually the quietest person in the room, said that her father had called her 20 minutes ago and told her to stay exactly where she was and not to open any doors, and that his voice had sounded the way it sounded when he was lying to her about something being fine. I collected what I could from what they were sharing, not by asking them to report, but by listening to the murmur that had replaced the silence. And what I assembled was a picture with most of its pieces missing. Something was happening in the town. Something medical, or something that behaved like something medical. Hospitals were overwhelmed or closing. Emergency services were not responding normally. People were being told to shelter in place, not just here but apparently everywhere, through channels that were themselves beginning to fail. I told them what I tell my own son when he's frightened, and the explanation is complicated. That we know where we are. We know we're safe right now, and we're going to stay that way by doing what's asked of us until we know more. Eli is 7, and when I say this to him it works because he trusts me without reservation. These were juniors in high school, and some of them trusted me, and some were already beginning to calculate on their own. But the words still had enough weight to settle the room for a while. The second hour was when I started thinking structurally about the room itself. Room 214 is a standard classroom. 30 desks, a teacher's desk, a whiteboard, 2 windows facing east toward the faculty parking lot, 1 door to the hallway, a small closet at the back containing supplies I mostly never use. I inventoried what we had. A case of bottled water left over from a parent-teacher event, maybe 16 bottles. A box of granola bars someone had donated for a student pantry initiative that I'd never delivered to the office. A first aid kit mounted to the wall near the door, basic, containing Band-Aids and antiseptic, and 2 instant cold packs. My jacket, a few students' jackets. Backpacks full of the usual, binders, laptops, chargers, an assortment of snacks. One student, Tyler Reeves, had a full packed lunch because he doesn't eat the cafeteria food, and he'd brought it the third period because he'd missed his locker stop. These are the things I cataloged, not because I believed we'd need them, but because cataloging is what I do when the edges of things start to blur. I count. I sort. I make the problem fit the tools. What I did not do was look out the windows more than necessary. I'd looked once, early, and seen the parking lot as I'd left it. Half full, quiet, a few birds on the fence near the dumpsters. Nothing wrong. But some instinct, some residue of every lockdown drill I'd ever participated in, told me to keep the blinds mostly closed, and I did. And I told the students to stay away from them. The intercom came on again, at what I estimate was around 11:15. This time the voice was different. Male. Possibly Mr. Garza, the principal, though it was hard to tell because the sound quality had degraded, or the person speaking was farther from the microphone, or both. The message was brief. Remain in classrooms. Situation is ongoing. Do not attempt to leave the building. Emergency services are aware. Then a pause. And then something I've thought about many times since. Teachers, use your judgment. That was it. The intercom clicked off and did not come on again. Use your judgment. I want you to understand what that sentence did to the room. Not to the students, they barely reacted. But to me, standing by the door with my hand on the lock I'd turned 2 hours ago. Those 3 words dismantled something. Because the entire structure of what I'd been doing, staying, waiting, following the protocol, was built on the assumption that someone above me was making decisions I didn't have to make. That the chain was intact. Lock the door. Wait for instructions. Trust the system. Use your judgment was the system telling me it was no longer the system. It was a hand letting go of a rope and telling me the rope was now mine. I don't think anyone else in the room understood that. But I understood it immediately, because I have spent 11 years in a profession built on the tension between authority and autonomy. Between what the administration tells you and what the room in front of you actually needs. And I have always known that those 2 things are held together by the administration's willingness to keep holding them together. When they let go, you are alone with your judgment. And your judgment is just you. And you are just a person standing in a room. The hallway sounds changed around midday. I don't know if it was exactly midday, because by then I'd stopped checking the clock with any precision. Time had begun to behave differently, stretching and compressing in ways that made the clock feel unreliable, even though it wasn't. But roughly midday, the silence in the hallway broke. Not with a single sound, but with a texture of sound. Something layered and uneven that I couldn't immediately identify. Movement, I thought. Multiple sources. Not the clean rhythm of footsteps, but something looser, less coordinated. A door closing somewhere below us, hard. Then another. Cameron Weiss, the boy who'd arrived late with a counselor's pass, crawled on his hands and knees to the windows before I could stop him. He lifted one slat of the blinds with his finger, looked for maybe 3 seconds, and then lowered it and crawled back. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Whatever he'd seen had reorganized his face into something I'd never seen on a student before. Not fear exactly, but a rapid, involuntary recalibration, like watching someone's operating system crash and reboot in real time. He sat down next to Marcus Dean and pulled his knees to his chest, and that was the moment, I think, when the room understood that outside was no longer a version of inside with more space. Outside had become something else entirely. I went to the window myself. I lifted the blind just enough. The parking lot was no longer empty and no longer still. There were figures in it, 4, maybe 5, and they were moving in a way I will describe as carefully as I can because precision matters here and exaggeration would be easy and wrong. They moved with direction but without apparent purpose. They were not running, not walking in any way I recognized. The motion was effortful and arrhythmic, like people wading through something that wasn't there.
One of them, and I could see this clearly because the October light was bright and the lot is only about 60 feet from the building, had dark staining on the front of their clothing, extensive staining, and their left arm hung at an angle that was physiologically wrong. They were not behaving as injured people behave. Injured people stop. Injured people sit down. These figures were moving with a constancy that looked mechanical, except that machines are smooth and these were not. I lowered the blind. I went back to my desk. I sat down. I think I sat there for a full minute before anyone spoke, and when someone did, Anya Patel, sitting closest to me, she said, "Mr. Calloway, what do we do?" And I said, "We stay here. We're okay here." And both of those things were true, and neither of those things answered her question. The first real conflict inside the room started in the early afternoon, maybe around 1:30.
A boy named Derek Fowler, who sits in the back row, and who I know primarily as a quiet, somewhat sullen presence who does his work without enthusiasm, but does it. Derek stood up and said he was leaving. Not asked, said. His mother was alone at home, he told the room. His father worked in Philadelphia and wouldn't be back. His mother had a condition, he didn't say what, and she needed her medication managed, and he needed to go home. He said this with a calm that I recognized, because it was my calm. The calm of someone who has decided and is now merely announcing. I stood up too. I stood up because that is what you do when a student challenges the structure of the room. You meet them at their level, physically, so the conversation is between equals rather than between a seated authority and a standing challenger. I told Derek I understood his concern. I told him I couldn't let him open the door. I told him that we didn't know what was in the hallway, that we had no information about conditions outside the building, that leaving now could be the most dangerous thing he could do. I told him that his mother would want him to be safe. He looked at me the way students look at you when they know you're right about the facts, but wrong about the priority. My mother would want me to be there, he said. And that landed, because it was true, and because I was standing in a room 60 miles from Sarah and Eli, and if I'd been able to walk out that door and drive home, I don't know if the laminated card in my desk drawer would have stopped me. Derek didn't leave. Not then. But the conversation changed the room's chemistry in a way I couldn't reverse. Up until that point, staying had been the default. The thing you did because you'd been told to, and because there was no compelling reason not to. After Derek, staying became a choice, which meant it required justification, which meant it could be questioned. 3 or 4 other students, I noted them but I won't list their names, shifted visibly, crossed arms, glances at the door. The particular posture of a person who is staying but is now aware that leaving is on the table. I did something then that I'd been avoiding. I addressed the room directly about what was happening outside. Not what we'd heard, not what the intercom had said, but what I believed. I told them that something serious was occurring,
that it appeared to involve a medical crisis that was affecting how people behaved, and that the safest place we could be was exactly where we were. I told them that the building was locked, that we were on the second floor, and that we had water and food enough for now. I told them that panic was the most dangerous thing in the room.
I said all of this in my teaching voice, measured, unhurried, the voice I use for difficult material. And I watched them receive it, each in their own way. Some nodded, some stared. Priya wrote something in her notebook, quickly, the way she does when she's processing. Derek looked at the floor. Then I said something I hadn't planned to say. I said, I have a family too, a wife and a little boy. And I'm choosing to stay here with you because I believe it's the right thing to do. And because I believe I'll see them again if I'm smart about this. I hadn't meant to say it. Personal disclosure is something I generally avoid in the classroom. It shifts the dynamic, makes the teacher a character in a story that isn't supposed to be about them. But I said it because Derek had said the truest thing anyone had said all day. And the room needed to know that I wasn't asking them to do something I wasn't also doing. That staying cost me something too. It worked. Not completely, not permanently. But for the next few hours, the room settled into something resembling functional stability. Students talked in low voices. Some slept, or tried to. Tyler Reeves divided his lunch into portions and passed them around, and I distributed the granola bars, 2 students per bar, and we drank the water sparingly. Anya organized the backpack snacks into a small pile by the closet and counted them without being asked. Marcus charged phones using the power strip behind my desk, prioritizing those that still had signal, though by mid-afternoon, those were fewer and fewer. The room took on the quality of a thing being managed, not comfortable, not okay, but held. I used that window of relative calm to think, really think, not just react. The school building is a standard 2-story structure built in 1987, renovated in 2004. Cinder block walls, steel frame doors, commercial-grade locks. The second floor has 12 classrooms, 4 restrooms, a small faculty office, and 2 stairwells, one at each end of the hallway. The first floor has the main entrance, the cafeteria, the gymnasium, the offices. I knew from the emergency plan that in a full lockdown, exterior doors are secured by the front office. Electronically, if the system is functioning, manually, if not. I also knew that the school had approximately 60 staff and perhaps 400 students on any given day, distributed across both floors in a pattern I could roughly estimate from the schedule. What I didn't know was how many rooms were occupied. How many teachers had locked their doors and were doing what I was doing. How many rooms were empty. Whether the first floor had been breached. Whether anyone was still in the office. Whether, in the hours since the last intercom announcement, anyone at all was operating in any coordinating capacity. The silence from the intercom was not merely an absence of information. It was information itself, and what it told me was that the administrative layer between us and the crisis had either collapsed or gone quiet. And in practical terms, those amounted to the same thing. Around 4 o'clock, and I know this because someone's phone alarm went off, set for the end of the school day, 2 things happened in quick succession. First, we heard a sound from the hallway that was unmistakably a door being forced. Not kicked open dramatically, the way it happens in movies. A sustained pressure sound, a groaning of the hinges, and then a crack that carried through the cinder block like a muffled shot. It came from the west end of the hall, near the far stairwell. Several students flinched. One girl, whose name I'm ashamed to say I can't remember in this moment, a transfer student, relatively new, began crying, quietly, with her hands over her mouth, making almost no sound, which was somehow worse than if she'd screamed. The second thing was that Derek Fowler stood up again. This time he didn't announce. He just stood and walked toward the door, and I stepped in front of him, and we stood there facing each other in the narrow space between the door and the first row of desks. He was taller than me by at least 2 inches. He was 17. He was terrified, and he was doing what terrified people do when they feel trapped, which is move toward the only exit, any exit, regardless of what's on the other side. I put my hand on his shoulder, not to restrain him. I am not a large man, and restraining a 17-year-old boy determined to leave would not have gone well. But to make contact, to create a point of physical connection that might compete with the pull of the door. I said his name. I said, "Derek, not yet, not right now." And he stopped. Not because I'd convinced him, but because something about the specificity of "not yet" gave him a timeline, implied a future in which leaving might be possible, and that was enough to loosen the lock of his decision for a few more minutes. He sat down. He didn't look at me. The sound from the hallway didn't repeat, but it didn't need to. The room had heard it, and the room had understood what it meant. The building was not sealed. Whatever was outside was now also inside, somewhere, on our floor or below us, separated from us by a door that was locked but was not. I now understood with a clarity that felt physical, designed to withstand what might be trying to open it. The locks on classroom doors are privacy locks. They are designed to keep students out during planning periods. They are not designed for this. I began, quietly, to restructure the room. I asked Marcus and Tyler to move the teacher's desk, a heavy steel and laminate thing, against the door. We did it slowly, trying not to scrape, and the sound was still louder than I wanted. We stacked 4 student desks on top of it, interlocking the legs the way you'd build a makeshift barricade, which is not something I'd ever practiced or thought about, but which seemed, in the moment, intuitive, obvious. Anya and Priya moved the remaining desks to form a secondary barrier about 4 feet behind the first. None of this was discussed or debated. It happened with the coordinated efficiency of people who have all arrived at the same conclusion independently and are simply acting on it. When it was done, the door was no longer really a door. It was a wall with a seam, and we were on one side of it, and everything else was on the other. And the room had shrunk by about 1/3, and 26 students and 1 teacher were now occupying a space that felt less like a classroom and more like the inside of something that had been swallowed. That first night was the longest. Not because anything happened, relatively little happened compared to what came later, but because darkness changes everything in ways that daylight makes you forget. The overhead fluorescents stayed on, which was a mercy, though their hum became oppressive in a way I'd never noticed before, a persistent vibration at the edge of hearing that seems to colonize the silence. I turned off half of them using the wall switch, partly to conserve whatever goodwill the electrical grid still had, partly because the full brightness felt wrong, too exposed, too much like daytime. And the dissonance between what the lights said and what the windows said was making my skin crawl. Students slept in shifts, though I didn't organize it that way. They organized themselves, naturally, the way a group does when it's been confined long enough to develop its own rhythms. Some slept with their backs against the wall, heads on backpacks. Some couldn't sleep and sat with their phones, scrolling through whatever fragments still came through. The Wi-Fi had died sometime in the late afternoon, just gone, like the cell signal, like the intercom. Another thread snipped. A few students had downloaded content, and I saw the blue glow of screens playing saved videos, the sound turned off or held close to ears. Normal teenage behavior in an abnormal context. And I found it oddly steadying. I didn't sleep.
I sat in the corner nearest the barricaded door and listened. The hallway had sounds now. Not constant, not regular, but present. Soft impacts. A dragging quality, like something heavy being moved slowly across linoleum. Once, a sound that might have been a voice, or might have been the building settling, or might have been something I invented, because the silence was a kind of pressure, and the mind fills pressure with content. I couldn't tell. I sat and I listened, and I thought about Sarah and Eli, and I did something I don't often do, which is pray. Not formally, not with any structure, just a sustained internal request directed at no one in particular, asking that they were somewhere safe, somewhere locked, somewhere with a person like the person I was trying to be. Eli would be confused. He's 7, and 7-year-olds live in a world where adults handle things, where the scary parts have borders, where you can turn them off or walk away. Sarah would be handling it. She's a pragmatist. She's the one who keeps the emergency kit in the hall closet, the one who refills prescriptions before they run out, the one who, when the power went out last February, had candles and a battery radio ready before I'd even found a flashlight. She would be handling it, and she would be scared, and she would be wondering where I was. And that thought, not the sounds in the hallway, not the figures in the parking lot, not the dead intercom. That thought was the thing I had to manage most carefully, because it was the thought that could make me open the door. Dawn came slowly and brought no relief, only visibility. I looked through the blinds again, briefly. The parking lot had more figures in it now, maybe a dozen. They moved in the same arrhythmic way, drifting in patterns that seemed almost gravitational, orbiting nothing, pulled by stimuli I couldn't identify. One of them was wearing what appeared to be a school staff polo, the burgundy one with the logo on the chest. I couldn't tell who it was from that distance and angle, and I stopped trying because the effort of trying was bringing me close to a line I didn't want to cross. It is one thing to know abstractly that colleagues and neighbors have been affected by whatever this is. It is another to identify them by their shirt. The second day introduced problems I hadn't anticipated. The bathroom situation first. 27 people, no restroom access. I won't describe this in detail because the specifics are undignified and, in the scope of everything else, small. But the practical reality of it consumed an outsized portion of my attention. We improvised with the supply closet, trash bags, and a level of communal discomfort that bonded some students and humiliated others. I tried to manage it with as much normalcy as I could. I assigned times. I hung a jacket over the closet opening for privacy. I treated it as a logistical problem, which is what it was, because treating it as anything else, as a sign of how far we'd fallen, as evidence that the structure I'd been maintaining was cosmetic, would have been accurate but unhelpful. Water became the pressing issue. 16 bottles for 27 people. I rationed. Small drinks at what I estimated were 4-hour intervals, roughly a quarter of a bottle per person per round. This was not enough. I knew it wasn't enough. The human body needs more than this, and after 24 hours in a closed room with rising temperature, the HVAC had stuttered and died sometime in the night. People were thirsty in a way that rationing couldn't address. We'd be out of water by the end of the second day. I knew this. I did the math more than once, hoping the numbers would change, and they didn't, because numbers don't do that. This is when I began to think about leaving the room. Not leaving as in fleeing. Leaving as in making a calculated trip. Down the hall to the faculty kitchenette, which had a sink and, if the water was still running, could fill every bottle we had. 60 feet of hallway, maybe less. 2 minutes. A specific, bounded action with a specific, bounded goal. The kind of thing that sounds reasonable when you say it as a plan, and sounds insane when you think about what's between you and the faucet. I didn't make the decision immediately. I spent the morning thinking about it, turning it, examining it from angles. The rational angle. We need water. The water is 60 feet away. The hallway may or may not be safe, but will not become safer with time. And waiting until we're dehydrated means making the trip in worse condition. The responsible angle. I am in charge of these students, and leaving the room means leaving them, even briefly, which is an abdication, a crack in the structure I've built. The personal angle. If something happens to me in that hallway, I don't come home. Eli grows up with a father who went into a hallway and didn't come back. Sarah gets a story without an ending. I told Marcus, quietly at the back of the room, while most students dozed in the late morning heat, what I was thinking. I chose Marcus because he'd been the most consistently composed, because he'd taken on logistical tasks without being asked, because in the informal hierarchy that had emerged, he was something like a second. He listened. He said, "I can go." I said no. He said, "It makes more sense. I'm faster. I'm younger." I said no again, and I meant it. And the reason I meant it was simple and not particularly noble. He was my student, and I was his teacher. And the fundamental transaction of that relationship is that I do not send him into danger regardless of his qualifications. That's not in the laminated card, but it doesn't need to be. I explained my plan to the room. I did it formally, standing, the way I'd explain a lesson. I'm going to the faculty kitchenette. I'll be gone for no more than 5 minutes. Marcus is in charge while I'm gone. Do not move the barricade until you hear my voice and my knock. 3 knocks, pause, 2 knocks. If I'm not back in 10 minutes, do not come looking for me. Stay here. That last instruction was the hardest to say, because it contained within it the acknowledgement that I might not come back. And saying it out loud made it real in a way that thinking it had not. They moved the desks. I moved the teacher's desk, slowly, just enough to open the door 12 inches. The hallway smell hit me first. Stale, biological, layered. Not the hallway I'd walked through every day for 11 years. The lights were on, some of them, in a pattern that suggested some had blown or been broken. The floor had marks on it that I examined without interpreting because interpretation would have slowed me down. I went left. The kitchenette was 4 doors down. I moved along the wall, quickly, not running, because running makes noise, and noise seemed like something to avoid. Every door I passed was closed. Some were locked. I could tell by the slight resistance when I tested them with my fingers as I passed, not opening, just checking. Some had sounds behind them. One had what I am going to describe as a low, sustained vocalization that was not speech. It was tonal, but arrhythmic. A sound produced by a human throat, but not organized by a human mind, and I passed it and did not stop. The kitchenette door was open. The room was empty. The faucet worked. Water came out, clear, with normal pressure. And the relief I felt in that moment was profound and embarrassing in its intensity. Because it was just water. Just a faucet doing what faucets do. But it felt like evidence that the world was still partially itself. I filled every bottle I'd brought, 6 of them, stuffed into a canvas bag from the supply closet. I filled them fast. And then I did something I hadn't planned. I listened. Stood in the kitchenette with the faucet off and listened to the building. And what I heard was this. The building was occupied. Not by silence, not by the dead hum of an empty school. It was occupied by movement and sound, scattered through the floors and walls, present but not patterned, like an ecosystem that had replaced the one I knew. The school was no longer a school. It was a habitat. and the things inhabiting it were not students and teachers. I went back. 3 knocks, pause, 2 knocks. Marcus opened the gap. I squeezed through. They sealed it behind me. I distributed the water and I sat down, and my hands shook for about 5 minutes. And I let them, because there was no point in hiding it, and because the students had seen me go and come back, and the shaking was, in a way, more reassuring than steadiness would have been. It said, this was hard. I was afraid. I did it anyway. Those are the components of a kind of trust that steadiness alone can't build. The second afternoon brought a new problem, or rather, an old problem that had been building beneath the surface and finally broke through. A group of students, 5 of them, with Derek at the center, had been talking in the back corner with an intensity I'd been monitoring. When Derek approached me, he didn't stand the way he'd stood before. He stood with the group behind him, slightly, the way people stand when they've organized. "Mr. Calloway," he said, "we want to leave." Not I. We. He laid out their reasoning, and it was not unreasonable. They'd been in this room for over 30 hours. The situation was not improving. The school was compromised. They'd all heard what I'd heard, and some of them had heard more. Their families were out there. They had homes, some of them close, within walking distance. Staying here was waiting to die slowly instead of taking a chance on living. He said this calmly, with the rhetorical structure of someone who had prepared. And I realized that what I was witnessing was not a rebellion, but a proposal, and that Derek had done me the courtesy of framing it as one. I listened. I asked the room to listen too, and they did. 21 students watching 5 students watching me. The geometry of it was the geometry of every disagreement I'd ever mediated, except that the stakes were not a grade or a seat assignment, but something I couldn't guarantee. I told them what I'd seen in the hallway. I described it precisely: the sounds, the condition of the corridor, the noises behind doors. I told them what I'd seen in the parking lot. I told them that I could not, in honesty, tell them that the school was safe, but that I also could not tell them that outside was safer. I told them that movement through the building required passing a stairwell that I had not assessed, reaching a ground floor I had no information about, and exiting through doors that may or may not be functional, into an exterior space that was demonstrably occupied by people who were no longer behaving as people. I told them that I understood their reasoning, and that I disagreed with their conclusion. Derek said, "You can't keep us here." And he was right. This is the thing that nobody tells you about authority in a classroom, the foundational fact that the entire enterprise is built on and simultaneously ignores. It's voluntary. Every student who sits in a desk and listens does so because they've agreed to, because the social contract holds, because the structure is reciprocal. I give you knowledge and order. You give me compliance and trust. When the contract breaks, when the knowledge is insufficient and the order is arbitrary, compliance is no longer owed. Derek was right. I could not keep them there. I had never been able to keep them there. I had only been able to make staying seem like the better option, and for 5 of them, it no longer did. I said, "I know I can't. I'm asking you to stay." There was a long pause. The room breathed. I could hear the fluorescent lights. I could hear someone's stomach growl. I could hear, faintly, something moving in the hallway. Something with weight. One of the 5, a girl named Kayla Brooks, who I knew played soccer and had a scholarship pending, said, "Mr. C, my house is literally 6 blocks from here." She said it as if distance were the only variable, as if 6 blocks were 6 blocks regardless of what filled them. I said, "I know where you live, Kayla. I've been to your parents' house for conference night." Something about that, the specificity, The reminder that I knew her not as a body in a room, but as a student with a house and parents and a conference night, shifted something. She sat down. One of the other four sat down with her. Derek and two others remained standing. I could have argued more. I could have described in greater detail what was in the parking lot, what the figures looked like, how they moved. I could have been graphic. I could have tried to scare them into staying. I didn't, because fear is a leash, not a bond, and I had spent my career trying to build the second and avoid the first. Derek left. He left with Tomas Guerrero and a boy named Will Pratt. They moved the barricade just enough. They were gentle about it, careful, which I found almost unbearable. And they opened the door, and they looked at me, and I looked at them, and Derek said, "Thank you, Mr. Calloway." And then they were in the hallway, and the door was closed, and the barricade was rebuilt, and the room was 24. I have thought about that moment more than any other. Not because of what happened to them. I don't know what happened to them, not with certainty, and the absence of certainty is its own particular form of weight. But because of the decision I made in letting them go. I could have physically blocked the door. I could have made a scene, created enough chaos to disrupt their plan. I didn't. I let 3 students walk into a hallway that I knew was dangerous, because the alternative was to hold them against their will. And the moment I did that, I was no longer their teacher. I was their captor. And I could not make that transition, could not cross that line, not because I was brave, but because the line was the last thing I recognized as mine. The room after their departure was quieter in a way that had nothing to do with volume. Something had been removed that wasn't just 3 bodies. An argument had been settled or abandoned, and the settling left a residue of unease that I could feel, but couldn't address, because addressing it would mean acknowledging that Derek might have been right. And acknowledging that would unravel the thin fabric of purpose that was keeping the rest of us functional. Night 2 was worse than night 1. The sounds in the hallway were closer, more sustained. At one point, something contacted our door. Not a knock, not a push, but a pressure, a leaning, as if something had come to rest against it and was simply there, occupying the space between the door and the barricade with its weight. We sat in the dim room and listened to it, and nobody spoke. It lasted maybe 20 minutes, and then it moved on, or fell, or shifted, and the door was just a door again, and we breathed. I found myself doing something I'd never done in a classroom. I told stories. Not lessons, not curriculum. Stories about nothing of consequence. I told them about the time I locked my keys in my car at a gas station in Maryland during a road trip and had to wait 3 hours for a locksmith who turned out to be 80 years old and who opened the car in 11 seconds. I told them about my college roommate who tried to cook a Thanksgiving turkey in a dorm room using a prohibited hot plate and set off every fire alarm in the building. I told them about Eli learning to ride a bicycle last summer. How he'd insisted on no training wheels and fallen 17 times, I counted, before making it to the end of the driveway. And how he'd turned around with a face so incandescent with triumph that Sarah had cried and pretended she hadn't. These were not important stories. They were not relevant. They were irrelevant by design, because irrelevance was the point. They reminded the room that there existed a world outside this room, where people locked their keys in cars and burned turkeys and learned to ride bicycles. And that world was not gone, not erased, just temporarily inaccessible. And we were going to get back to it. Other students told stories too. Marcus talked about his grandmother in Puerto Rico, who had survived Hurricane Maria by refusing to leave her house and sitting in her bathroom with her cat for 16 hours while the roof peeled off above her. Priya talked about her family's first year in the United States, when they'd lived in a studio apartment in Trenton, and she'd slept in a closet that her mother had converted into a bedroom with fairy lights and a curtain. Anya talked about her sister's wedding, the one detail she kept returning to being the shoes, custom-made, hand-beaded, that her sister had worn for 20 minutes before taking off because they hurt, and she danced barefoot the rest of the night on a marble floor. The stories did what stories do. They created a space that was not this space. They gave us somewhere else to be while we stayed exactly where we were. The third day broke something. Not in the room, in the building. I don't know what caused it. A failure in the electrical system, or a consequence of whatever had happened on the first floor, or simply the accumulated weight of a building that was being used in ways it was not designed for. The lights went out at approximately 6 a.m., all of them, at once, with a sound like a sigh. The hum ceasing, the fluorescent flicker dying, and then darkness. Not complete darkness. The windows let in the gray light of an overcast October morning, and several students had phones with flashlight functions, though the batteries were mostly depleted. But the loss of the lights did something that the loss of the intercom and the Wi-Fi and the cell signal had not. It made the room feel uninhabited, like the building had stopped acknowledging our presence, like we were squatting in something that had already been abandoned by every system that had once sustained it. I rationed the phone lights. I designated 2 as our primary sources, Marcus's, which had the most remaining battery, and my own, which I'd kept off almost continuously. The rest were to stay dark unless needed. We had water from my hallway trip, maybe enough for another day at the rate we were going. We had a handful of snacks. We had a first aid kit that, mercifully, we'd barely touched. We had each other, 24 people in a room designed for 30, which should have felt spacious, but felt close, because the barricade had eaten the front third of the room, and the closet had become a bathroom, and the remaining space was filled with bodies and backpacks, and the particular heaviness of people who have been still for too long. I need to talk about what happened next with precision, because it was the moment that changed my understanding of what I was doing and why. Around midday on the third day, we heard something from the hallway that was different from anything we'd heard before. It was organized sound, rhythmic, purposeful. It was knocking, not on our door, but on another door nearby, and it was accompanied by a voice, a human voice, saying words I couldn't quite make out, but which had the cadence and structure of language. Someone was in the hallway. Someone who was still a someone. The room reacted immediately. Students sat up. Eyes went to the door. Anya grabbed my arm. The hope in the room was like a change in air pressure, sudden, physical, almost painful. I went to the door. I pressed my ear to it. The knocking had moved, was farther away now, and the voice was still speaking, and I caught fragments. "Anyone? Open. We're coming through." And then something that might have been military, or Mitchell, or something else entirely. The acoustics of the hallway made everything approximate. I had a decision to make, and I had to make it immediately. Open the barricade, respond, make contact, risk exposure for the possibility of rescue, or information, or at minimum, the knowledge that someone else was still operating, still moving through the building with intention and language. The alternative was silence. Stay hidden, stay sealed, stay safe in the way that a coffin is safe, and possibly miss the one chance we'd have at organized help. I knocked. 3 times, hard. I shouted my name through the door. "Steve Calloway, room 214. I have 23 students." The hallway went quiet. Then footsteps, quick and deliberate, coming toward us. Then a voice, close, on the other side of the barricade. "Mr. Calloway, it's Jim Paredes. I've got 4 students and Mrs. Okafor. We're coming from room 208.
Jim Paredes teaches algebra. He's been at the school for 6 years. I know his voice, and this was his voice. And the relief of that recognition, of knowing that on the other side of the door was a person I'd sat next to in faculty meetings, whose coffee order I knew, who had once helped me fix a paper jam in the copier. The relief was so complete that I had to press my forehead against the door and breathe before I could respond. We opened the barricade. It took 2 minutes, and every second of those 2 minutes was a calculation. When the gap was wide enough, Jim came through first, then his students, 4 sophomores, wide-eyed and thin-looking. And then Karen Okafor, the English teacher from down the hall, who was holding a fire extinguisher like a weapon, and who looked at me and said, "Steve, the first floor is gone." They sealed in with us. 31 people now. Jim and Karen had information, and I absorbed it the way a sponge absorbs water, indiscriminately, completely, without filtering. The first floor had been breached early on the first day, probably through the cafeteria loading dock, which had an exterior door with a push bar that wouldn't have withstood sustained pressure. The office staff had tried to maintain control for several hours before going silent. Jim had made 2 trips into the hallway, one on the first day, one that morning, and had mapped which rooms were still occupied and which were not. 3 other classrooms on the second floor had people in them. 2 were locked and silent and hadn't responded to his knocking, which could mean anything. The stairwells were compromised. He'd seen figures on the stairs, moving between floors with the same directionless persistence I'd observed in the parking lot. The west stairwell was worse than the east. The east still had long intervals of emptiness between whatever moved through it. Karen's information was different in character. She'd been monitoring a battery-powered AM radio that she kept in her classroom for reasons she described as old habit from growing up in tornado country. The broadcasts had been sporadic and increasingly fragmented, but the picture they painted was consistent. This was not local. It was regional at minimum, possibly national. The terminology being used on the air had shifted over the 3 days from outbreak to crisis to language that Karen said sounded like people describing something they didn't have words for yet. Military operations were referenced, but never confirmed. Evacuation routes were mentioned and then contradicted. The broadcasts had stopped entirely around dawn on the 3rd day, and the radio now produced only static. I sat with this information the way I sit with a difficult text, reading it, rereading it, looking for what it said and what it didn't say. What it said was that we were not going to be rescued in the short term. What it didn't say was what to do about that. Jim and I talked in the back corner, low voices, while Karen organized the combined group. Her instinct was the same as mine, which was to give people tasks so that idleness didn't become despair. Jim's assessment was blunt. We couldn't stay here indefinitely. Water was a day away from gone. Food was already gone. The room was hot. 31 bodies, no ventilation, no climate control, and would become a health problem before it became a starvation problem. We needed to move, and we needed to move before moving became physically difficult. I resisted this. Not the logic was sound, but the implication, which was that every principle I'd been operating on for 3 days was about to be reversed. Stay in the room, keep the door locked, wait for help. These had been my commandments, my structure, the framework that had kept 26 people, now 23, now 31, alive and sane. Abandoning them felt not like adaptation, but like betrayal. Like admitting that the instructions had been wrong from the start, and that my faith in them had been not leadership, but obedience dressed in a teacher's authority. But Jim was right. I knew he was right. And Sarah, if she were here, would have told me he was right in the first sentence, and then started packing. We planned. We planned the way I plan lessons, methodically, with contingencies, with roles assigned.
Jim would lead. He knew the building better than I did. He'd coached track and had keys to the athletic wing, which connected to an exterior door near the bus loop. Karen would manage the middle of the group, keeping people together, maintaining pace. I would bring up the rear, because the rear was the most dangerous position, and because I was the one asking 30 people to leave the only safe space they'd known for 3 days, and I owed them the risk of being last. We'd move in the early afternoon, when Jim said the hallway activity tended to thin. He'd observed what he described as a rough pattern, though he was careful to say it might be coincidence. We'd go east, toward the stairwell that was less compromised, down one flight, through the connector hallway to the athletic wing, out through the side door, into the bus loop, then across the faculty lot, then, and here the plan became aspiration, toward the commercial district 3 blocks north, where the buildings were smaller and more numerous and might offer options that a school building no longer could. I explained the plan to the room. I did it the way Jim and Karen and I had agreed, clearly, without minimizing the risk, without overpromising the outcome. I told them that staying was no longer sustainable. I told them that we had a route and a formation and a destination. I told them that this was the most dangerous thing we would do, and that I would not pretend otherwise. I told them to leave behind everything that wasn't essential, to wear shoes they could move in, to stay silent, to stay together, to follow the person in front of them and trust the person behind them. Anya raised her hand. She asked what we should do if we got separated. I told her, find a room, lock the door, wait. It was not a good answer. It was the same answer we'd been living for 3 days, and we were leaving because it had stopped working. But it was the only answer I had. We moved the barricade for the last time. Jim went first. The hallway was dim, no lights, the windows at the ends providing the only illumination, and it smelled the way a place smells when it has been given over to biology. We moved in a line. 31 people, silent or trying to be, shuffling in sock feet because Jim had suggested that shoes on linoleum were too loud and several students had opted for socks instead. The sound we made was barely a sound. A whisper of fabric, the occasional intake of breath, the soft, arrhythmic percussion of 31 hearts. We passed room 208, Jim's room. The door was open, the room empty, abandoned. We passed the faculty restroom. We passed the water fountain, which I reflexively checked. Dry. We passed a classroom whose door was closed, but whose narrow window showed, in the dimness, movement inside that was not the movement of a person waiting to be rescued. I did not let myself look for more than a second. I kept my hand on the shoulder of the student ahead of me, and I moved. And behind me, I felt the hand of the student behind me on my shoulder, and we were a chain, a single organism with 31 sets of legs and one shared intention. The stairwell was the worst part. Not because anything happened in it. Nothing did, and the absence of incident felt almost like a cruelty, a reprieve that would have to be paid for later. But because the stairwell was vertical, and vertical meant slow. And slow meant time. And time in an exposed space was a currency we were spending without knowing the balance. Jim led us down quickly. The stairs had marks on them that I observed and did not catalog. The landing between floors had a window, and through it I could see the parking lot. And the figures were still there. And for a moment I had the dissociative sensation of watching myself from outside. A line of people descending a staircase in a building that was no longer theirs, observed by things that had once been the community the building served. The connector hallway was long and narrow and dark. We moved through it single file, hands on walls. I could hear breathing, everyone's breathing, a collective respiration that sounded like wind in a tunnel. At the far end, the door to the athletic wing was closed but not locked. And Jim opened it, and the air on the other side was different, cooler, carrying the distant smell of cut grass through some ventilation gap. And the coolness was so shocking after 3 days of stale heat that several students gasped. The side door was there. Jim had the key. He put it in the lock, turned it, and pushed. And outside was outside. Gray sky, October air, the bus loop empty and wide and terrifyingly open after the compression of hallways and stairwells and a room that had been our world. We went. We went quickly, not running but not walking, moving with the sustained urgency of people who understand that speed and silence are both necessary and partially contradictory, and who are trying to honor both. The bus loop, the parking lot, the fence, which Jim held open where it met the gate, the sidewalk, the street. I looked back once. The school sat on its slight rise, brick and glass and institutional, looking exactly as it always had. No visible damage from this angle, no signs of what was inside it, no indication that it had become something other than what it was built to be. It looked like a school. It looked like where I went to work. It looked like a place where nothing had happened. And this was perhaps the most disorienting thing of all. That catastrophe could inhabit a structure without changing its exterior. That the shell could remain perfect while the inside was transformed beyond recognition. We moved north. The streets were quiet in the way that Jim had described. Not empty, but unpopulated in waves, with movement visible at distances that gave us time to adjust our route. We moved as a group, and the group held. And I stayed at the back and counted heads compulsively. 30, 31, 30, 31. Because the number was the last metric I had, the last thing I could control by counting. 3 blocks north, Jim led us to a strip mall with a hardware store and a laundromat and a dental office. And we entered the hardware store through a back door that was unlocked and found it empty and dark and stocked with things that were, for the first time in 3 days, useful. We sealed the door. We checked the space. We found water in a utility sink and canned air and batteries and tools that could serve as barriers or barricades or, if it came to it, things I didn't want to think about yet, but was beginning to think about. I sat down on the concrete floor of the hardware store's back room. Around me, 30 people were doing the same. Sitting, leaning, breathing, existing in a new space that was not the classroom, not the school, not the structure I'd known. Jim was already assessing the building's layout. Karen was doing a head count, then doing it again. Anya was organizing the bottles she'd carried. Still organized, still managing, still being the version of herself that the crisis had revealed rather than created. And I sat there, and I thought about what had just happened. Not the leaving. The leaving was mechanics, adrenaline, feet on pavement. What had happened before the leaving? 3 days in a room. 26 students who became 23, who became 31. A door that was locked because I was told to lock it, and then locked because I chose to lock it, and then opened because the lock had become the thing keeping us from surviving. An intercom that said, "Use your judgment," and then stopped talking. And a man who heard that and spent 3 days trying to figure out what his judgment actually was when separated from every structure that had previously told him. I am a teacher. This is what I keep returning to, the bedrock fact that everything else is built on. I am a teacher, and a teacher's authority is not inherent. It is granted by a system, by a schedule, by a building with a bell that rings at prescribed intervals. Remove the system, the schedule, the building, the bell, and what remains is a person in a room with other people. And the only authority that person has is the authority that the others choose to grant. moment by moment, based on nothing more reliable than the quality of the person's judgment and the consistency of their care. I had been that person. For 3 days, in a room that was never meant to be anything more than a place to discuss the Constitutional Convention and the Missouri Compromise, I had been that person. And I had done it imperfectly, with shaking hands and rationed water and a prayer I wasn't sure anyone was listening to. And I had lost 3 students who walked into a hallway I couldn't protect them in. And I had held 23 others by the thin thread of a trust I'm still not sure I deserved. And now we were here, in a hardware store, in a strip mall, in whatever the world was becoming. And I was still, somehow, by default or by habit or by something I don't have a name for, the person at the back of the line, counting heads, making sure the number held. Sarah, if you're reading this, and I don't know how you'd be reading this, but the thought of you reading it is the architecture of every decision I made. I locked the door, and I kept them safe, and I'm coming home. I don't know the route. I don't know how long it will take, but I'm coming. And Eli should know that his father did not sit in a room and wait. His father sat in a room and waited until waiting was the wrong answer, and then he moved. That is what I learned. Control is not a permanent state. It is a practice. Something you do until the conditions under which you're doing it change enough that the practice itself becomes the obstacle. And then you adapt. Not because you want to, not because you're ready, but because the alternative is to let the structure you built become the structure that buries you. We're in the hardware store now. It's late afternoon. Jim is planning our next move. Karen is on the radio again, scanning frequencies, finding nothing but not stopping. The students, my students, Jim's students, our students, are resting. I'm going to stop writing soon. The light is going, and we'll need to be ready for dark. But I wanted to put this down while it was still shaped like something I could hold. The 3 days, the room, the door, the choice. Before it becomes just another part of whatever comes next. Tomorrow, we move again. The direction is south, toward the residential streets, toward the houses that line the hill on the far side of town, toward home. I'm going to count heads one more time before I stop. 31. We're all still here.